Good morning. This is Gaming Perspectives with
Saul
and Jolene. And today we're talking about
Gnomes.
I like to call them gnomes.
Gnomes. Yes. Why is the G silent?
I don't think it is.
Well,
I know in English they make it silent, but if you're a gnome, I think it's not silent.
Gnot, right. We talked about dwarves in the past, elves, and gnomes. They're kind of a smaller group of people.
Every podcast I listened to and everything I read, the first sentence they said about gnomes was a joke about height.
I think it's necessary. It's mandatory.
Is it mandatory?
I
Well,
think so.
then
It's in
you
some Bible
have
somewhere.
complied.
Yes, so gnomes, I think they've been around since original D&D or AD&D, not as a playable race though. I think they were normally NPCs. I don't know exactly what edition gnomes became a playable character. I'm pretty sure. Man, I remember gnome illusionist, like being a big deal, and I think that could have been AD&D, but don't quote me. But definitely by third edition, gnomes became a playable character race.
I try my best
Or
not to quote
character.
you, and I'm not sure when gnomes came about, but since I've been playing, they were there.
Right, and I've never played a gnome before. Like I've
You
always,
did too.
okay, until recently I played two gnomes, but before that it had been, see, 1978. I didn't start playing gnomes until about 2021.
There you go.
So a good 30 years.
I found it interesting researching the gnomes. There's a whole bunch of people that don't like them, and I'm not sure why. And then I read about something called World of Warcraft.
World of Warcraft. Okay.
I know what it is.
Right.
I watched a show about it with Felicia Day, but
Oh yeah. And what about it?
well, I
why
guess in World of Warcraft, the gnomes are tricky or tricksters, or I don't know. They don't like them.
that? Oh,
I'm not sure why. I didn't really read about why they don't like them because I was like, well, that's silly.
well, I don't know too much about World of Warcraft. I never played. I've played.
I can tell you they're
Right.
in World of Warcraft. They're part of the Alliance. I don't know what
That's
that
the good
means.
people, the good guys. Men, elves, good people. Like I said, I didn't really play World of Warcraft. I've only downloaded it and played, like, made a character and stuff, but I don't think I ever played it to any extent. I think it's funny because a lot of people don't like when we talked about elves and read about elves and we read about dwarves. There is this dislike to some of those people just don't like playing elves. They don't like playing dwarves, and a lot of it was, I can understand, because of their nature of how to role play them might be a little bit difficult to role play. But gnomes seem more accessible because they're fun, they're fun loving, they're free spirited. They seem like a really happy people, and then people go, well, I'll just play a halfling. But I think what's interesting about gnomes is their origin, at least in Forgotten Realms. I've never really researched gnomes in Forgotten Realms, but they were supposedly enslaved by
By kobolds.
kobolds at the beginning, and then later on they were enslaved by other people, but then they became free, and even though that's kind of a sinister or terrible history, they still maintain their happy, lovable, very welcoming type of group of people.
Some of them.
Right. So, well,
Some of the forest gnomes try to stay away from anybody because they don't trust people.
well, that makes sense, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
But
And-
they'll happily let you into the forest.
As long as I think it's very interesting. Their whole,
And they fought their way out of the kobold thing, out of the kobolds.
yeah, I think so. I honestly,
At least that's what I read
story,
the other
yeah.
day. Yeah.
yeah. What I also like about the gnomes is that there is this connection to the Fey world, right?
Yes.
That they're like, if they're not descended from the Fey people or a Fey people, then they're touched by them in some way. This comes up in when you make a character, you have the ability to have like a magic trick, or they're somehow associated with magic. Like they can talk to animals if you like. There's one of the. It's like a feat, but it's more like a.
They're good.
Quality.
They're good magic users.
They're good illusionists.
Yes.
Right, and that has to do with their ties again to this Fae background or this Fae origin, possibly Fae origin. And like I said, I never really played gnomes. I never really thought about playing gnomes. I was very human centric in my game playing. Like I said, I hardly ever played an elf. The only time I ever played an elf or a half elf, I might have been a full elf, was when I wanted to become a multi-class character. For some reason, it gave me a bonus or something. But that was back in AD&D times.
I played a gnome fighter.
That was with me. When I played my...
I played a gnome fighter in Jim's game.
Oh, wow. That's right. I forgot about that. So...
Or was it Mike's game? I think it was Mike's game because that was when Jim jumped on the chicken.
Oh, it was definitely Mike's game.
Yeah.
And it wasn't a chicken.
Okay, but it was a big chicken.
It was a cockatrice, I think.
He described it as a big chicken.
Right, and so Jim quickly jumps on it. So they have these traits, these gnomes, right, that they like to tinker with stuff. Mm-hmm. They're very inquisitive. There's all these descriptives that people attribute to them.
They like to dress flashy. A lot of times they have, depending on the gnome, I mean, it depends on however you want to play the character. You have all kinds of different options. I like the fact mine had bright red hair, not like my red hair, but red.
Yeah.
And then she dressed in like purples and oranges, and she was a fighter. So
like a tinker from Robert.
Yeah.
And what do they call it? Garish colors?
Of course not. As a gnome, that's the way you are. That's the way you express yourself, right?
Bright colors would be better.
So there's a lot of ways for player characters to express themselves as gnomes. Saul loved the tinkering aspect, and one of the things I read was that gnomes often they live to be 500 years. They could, but a lot of times they die around 200 because they're so obsessed with one thing that they blow themselves up, or they accidentally mix the chemicals wrong and kill themselves. That kind of thing. Which I thought was very interesting.
I thought that was very interesting.
That the whole
too.
idea that they want to tinker with stuff. So Saul's gnome, he had a blunderbuss and he made it himself. So
right.
So
which is as big as I was.
Yeah.
Don't ask me how I fired it though. That was very strange.
That was the other time I played a gnome. I played a gnome and Saul played a gnome.
That was fun. Like I said, I've only played in the vast time that I've been playing role playing games, and especially D&D. Only in the last couple of years did I play a gnome, and I thought it was really fun. I thought it was a different way of, because gnomes have this tendency to be this happy-go-lucky type of people that I really embraced that part of it, and I was like, yeah, sure, let's do it. And then like one of my gnomes, the first one I made, he didn't like plans, or he couldn't follow a plan. And so once the other players knew that I had this like,
because if we made a plan, then if we called it a plan, he would mess it up.
Yeah, that was a quirk he had, and so so they banned plan from their
vocabulary.
So they would go, well, we're gonna make this, and then
and he would go, is this our plan? And everyone would go, no, this is not a plan.
No plan. It was very cool. It was very fun. I like the idea of playing this happy-go-lucky character, and like Jolene said, they're very curious. There's all these descriptors attributed to gnomes, and all of them are relatively positive, right? And I think that's pretty neat. I just really enjoyed the whole aspects of playing the gnome, and then there's also role-playing things that can come about from playing the gnome because of all these descriptions that people have attributed to gnomes.
One of the most interesting things about gnomes is they're very familial, or according to the lore, they stay in their clans and stuff.
Right.
And so if you're going to be an adventurer gnome, you need to have some kind of backstory that tells why you left, right? And mine was that the last gnome I played was they wanted her to start thinking about getting married, but she was only like 80 years old, and she wasn't quite ready for this kind of commitment. So she took off. She told him she wasn't going to get married, and she was going to go and see the world before she settled down.
Oh, I thought you went to go get a pack of cigarettes and a gallon of milk.
No, that must have been your character.
Exactly. So they have very extended familial relations,
Which shows that they're good in group settings, right? So in your player group, they're going to want to keep everybody together, or not necessarily. I'm using my hand gestures like I was a corgi trying to herd, but they're going to take care of, want to make sure everybody's good in the party, right? So they could be very curious as to what the wizard is doing, how the paladin, ask about the paladin's god, figure out how the fighter fights.
or
All of those,
or what weapons he uses,
Yeah.
or why he uses weapons.
So they might ask lots of questions, which is a cool way to play that character, I think.
Right. And I think that's another, they're called curious, right? That's another descriptor they have about being gnomes. And I think, and you add that to this idea that they're very family orientated, or clan, not even just a family, they're more like a clan, like an extended family, right? It's like, I can't think of anything, but one of the reasons that, or one of the ways that this is expressed is that everybody, like every adult that knows the gnome child, will give them their own name, like a personal name that they call them. And I think that's very interesting. And that gnome takes that name and it just adds it to his number of names that he has. And I think that's interesting because it shows that there's a bond between that gnome and not every adult, but every close adult that in that gnome's life. And when you go adventuring, that group of people that you're adventuring with, when you're a gnome, becomes your extended family. And if you look at it that way, even though the gnome might be joking around and goofing off and maybe upsetting some of those adventurers for being so goofy, he does or she does care about the group and wants to keep them safe, right? Like he may not or she may not like come across as like really being worried about people's health or their situation, because they're a bunch of jokesters too. So they might get in a bad habit of calling people names and stuff, or nicknames.
Well, that's part of their culture, though, is
Right.
nicknames.
Right. And so they're going to extend that to the adventuring group.
And the adventuring group is not going to understand that.
Or may not understand that.
And they're not going to understand it at first. Unless they've done their homework on gnomes, then they might.
And I really like that aspect about gnomes. And I was very, very interested in that aspect of gnomes because sometimes, a lot of times when you play, the connections between your background and then why you go adventuring sometimes doesn't make sense.
Or everybody's parents got killed by the orcs coming to the village.
There's always the orphan.
There's the little pats. On the name, I thought it was interesting. So gnomes have, like they said, between 8 and 15 names.
Right.
So when they go out into the world, the first time they introduce themselves, it's going to be like, I've met people not from the United States who have, like, maybe they don't have a middle name, but they have 2 surnames. What do you call them? Last names. So, and then they'll say, my name is such and such, such and such, such and such. And then they go, oh, so you're Mr. Jones. And they go, no, that's my mother's last name. I use this last name. Right. That kind of thing. So it's
Latinos, especially like Mexicans, they have that weird where they use their mother's name instead of their father's name.
Yes.
Last.
Yeah.
And
but that's not actually the name that they have on their birth certificate. I mean, it's the name on their birth certificate, but we know that it's the first last name that they go by, right?
Well, I'm not even sure sometimes.
It's hard to tell.
That's Mexicans. I'm not sure if that is also in Latin America as a whole. But when my parents came to the United States, they assimilated and just used
Morales.
Morales, my dad's last name, and then they didn't use middle names. Like none of us have middle names, so which is weird. Well, to some people in the United States, a lot of people have middle names.
Well, and it's a big joke for, not joke, but it's a big thing for a lot of teenagers in high school to try to figure out what. Sometimes when you're in school, they'll say your middle name, but sometimes they won't.
Right.
So, like if somebody was named Leslie, a guy, their middle name was Leslie because it was a family name, right?
Right.
I remember people
Mary.
trying to figure out the middle names so they could make fun of people, or because they're teenagers. Even adults, they did that on Friends with Chandler's character. I don't remember what his middle name was, but.
Well, our friend Mike, his middle name is Todd, and he doesn't like that name, and I don't know why. I don't know.
Probably because his brothers teased him about it.
Todd?
I don't know. I'm just saying.
Todd the Dodd. I don't know. And so I think the only time
My middle name is it sounds like a guy's middle name, right?
Ray.
And
Well, yeah.
most girls aren't named Ray, but I always tell people always go when they see my middle name, they go, "Oh, okay," because my mom spelled it like with a E instead of a Y to make it a girl's middle name, I guess. Because my dad's name was Joe Ray, so she named me Jolene Ray. My brother's name is also Jeffrey Ray, so it's a whole.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
I hadn't thought about that. But anyway, names are sort of important to gnomes and important to a lot of people. Like everybody is very, everybody has a name,
Right.
Right. And the reason I think it's funny about middle names is that according to a lot of comedic jokes in the United States, is that the only time they ever heard their middle name was when their mom was pissed off at them. Right?
Yeah.
And they would use their whole name, and that's when you knew you were in trouble.
Yeah.
Now, in my family, I only have my first name and last name, so there was none of that. So we didn't have that.
He knew if he was in trouble.
Yeah, no, definitely. Yeah.
So when a gnome goes out and they introduce themselves with their 8 names, they're going to discover quickly that they got to pick 1 or 2. So usually they go with like 3 names, and then they'll tell people what they want to be called, right?
Right. And they do have nicknames also. They
Yes.
might go by nickname. So I think it's very interesting. Everything about gnomes I had learned, I thought it was very, very cool. And the idea of names, like they'll even once they get into the world, some people might give them a nickname, and they'll take that nickname and they'll like add it to their litany of names, and then you can call me that, and they'll go by that name, and then that might. It's kind of funny because that might confuse the other characters and players going, "Oh, you're going by that nickname?" And they're like, "Yeah, I like it," and stuff like that. They'll add and take out names, not take out, but not use names at will sometimes. And I think that shows you the spontaneity of gnomes and how they're very easily acquiesce to different ways of looking at the world, and you couple that with curiosity, and you have a very, very interesting type of character. There's a couple of things here that I have is that when you consider playing a gnome because of their background, because of their history. Now, this is Forgotten Realms D&D. Other gnomes and other fantasy games
Might have a little bit different history.
right, but a lot of the stuff is similar because gnomes have this, for the most part, in the non-gaming. What is it?
In just the fantasy.
In non-gaming literature, there's the idea of gnomes, right? And I think that's a lot of those ideas that people have about gnomes in the general public have influenced RPGs the way they describe gnomes. Like they describe them being very small, right? They're like 3 feet tall. In the gaming, that's going to matter, right? When you have a 3 foot tall character,
Yeah, because your speed isn't as fast.
a large wall was going to be a problem, and or even a short wall.
Toss the gnome.
Yeah, that's really exactly. So the real world ideas about gnomes and what they're like, they're usually magical in some sense, and that has been translated or has has made it so that when gnomes are played in a role playing game, they are magical in a certain sense. So they have magic tricks, at least magic tricks, right? Like gnomes, garden gnomes. That whole idea that they move around and they are magical also translates into in a world like in a fantasy world where they're very attuned to magic and nature at the same time. So I just really like that whole idea of gnomes and how they fit in the world. So gnomes are pretty cool in that sense that they're slightly magical and very attuned to nature. That comes through in the
So
explanation.
in D&D, if you wanted to play a rogue, not a rogue, I'm sorry, a ranger, that would be, because rangers are, attached to nature.
Right.
That would be a good character class for a gnome.
Because they're small, they're really good at sneaking, and I think one of the special abilities is they can like hide in plain sight. And so of course a rogue would
Yeah, also be
fit in
good.
there.
A fighter, you could be a fighter gnome because they're known as fierce fighters.
Yeah, and I think
At least to the kobolds. I don't know about to humans.
small folk. Yeah, and then illusionist because
An illusionist,
they're
yes.
very in tune to illusion spells and stuff like that.
Saul took the idea of the tinkering and decided his last gnome was going to be this. He made guns, right? And
You made one.
one gun. Well, he was working on more, but trying to figure out. A lot of them blew up because he couldn't figure out the how much a gunpowder. So obviously there's a gunpowder in D&D, right? You can
Well,
be
we
a
were playing
guns.
Pathfinder.
Oh, we were playing Pathfinder, so you could be a gun. Are there
Gunslinger.
gunslingers? Yeah.
That was in one of the advanced players' books.
So it's different. It's a little bit, but Pathfinder, the gnomes are the same as in D&D,
Pretty
right?
much, yeah.
Yeah.
I took the tinkering. I took the gunfighters, gunslinger, yeah, gunslinger class, and I was a gnome, and they're like, I really like the idea of mixing like things that seem really odd, right? Like a gunslinger gnome. And I purposely didn't use pistols because, well, pistols would be cool, but I imagine this gnome who's like 3 and maybe 4 inches tall has this large weapon that's as tall as he is, and he's like aiming it and shooting and having this massive recoil, but being very effective in that sense. I just like that idea. My son wanted to run Pathfinder. I was able to do that, and then when we were playing low fantasy gaming, there is a character class, artificer, that can either be a tinker of like guns or tinker with like other things. So I go, oh, gun, and I was a gnome, so I'm like, yeah, let's do that. I thought it was very cool. I really liked it. He was real small, so he could hide when things got a little hairy. We only had 3 players at the time. It was a very small group. We got into trouble really quickly. and we were a lot of times we got into really big trouble, so I was able to hide when I needed to and stuff. I just like that kind of a character where he's just a little bit odd, and gnomes are odd to begin with, so I really liked it. One thing you got to come up with is for a gnome, because they're so attached to family, hardly a gnome is going to have that, like you said earlier, the orcs killed my father and mother.
Yeah.
Prepare to die, right? He's on a rampage to go avenge his family. I mean, it could be that way, but you'd have to
kill off a whole clan,
right?
Yeah.
And which is possible, but that's a lot of death and destruction. So why is a gnome adventuring? And because they're so tied to their family, and I think that makes for a good background. And you have to have a good reason to go adventuring, and that gives you a lot of role playing possibilities. Well, that's what I like about gnomes, is because they're just their character, the way they are. There's so many opportunities to role play. So why is this gnome adventuring when he has this very close knit family and stuff like that? So he's got to have a reason, or she has to have a reason to be out in the world.
We talked about that when we talked about elves and dwarves also. And I think out of the 3 races, I think that gnomes would be the easiest to play for your backstory and because you get to be quirky, so it's easier to come across as humanish, I guess. Some of the
Right. Just a real curious human.
because that's why a lot of people said you shouldn't play elves or
Right.
dwarves because
Right.
you couldn't get into that. You can't play them the way they should be played
Correct.
in their mind.
Right.
So I don't know. I think that I like gnomes. I think they're pretty cool.
Yeah. No, definitely.
I think that would be easier to play than, say, an elf if you wanted to do the role playing aspect of coming across as aloof, and
Yeah.
it's harder to role play aloof than it is to role play quirky.
Yeah, and fun loving and curious.
Because if you're aloof, you're not going to say a lot, is what I'm thinking.
I'm guessing, yeah. So another thing is what why adventure, how they associate with other PCs, right? So like the elf is going to be this aloof person, not wanting to talk to these lower beings and stuff like that. I'm just kidding, but that's the way they're going to come across as being stodgy or whatever. Where a gnome doesn't have that problem, right?
Right.
He's
curious and wants
curious.
to ask you 100 questions.
Right. And so there's going to be a lot of interaction between the characters if that's how you play. So there's a lot of role playing opportunities between just being the gnome, being curious, asking about why this works. You're going to have this feel like a parent of a 2-year-old that the last question they always ask is why. And no matter what your answer is, they're going to say why again. And then so it continues and continues. I think a lot of the PCs might get a little tired of their gnome, but at the same time, how do you not answer them, right? How can you be mad at this little guy who's just curious? And I think that's pretty cool. And I think, like I said, there's a lot of opportunity to role play within your group with your fellow players. I think that's pretty neat.
I think you're right, because in the aspect of the gnome wanting to feel a bond with his new clan that he's formed or she's formed. Like if you're in a fight or something, they might put themselves in risk to try to save you.
Yes. Because I think an extension of the idea of familial ties, the gnome is naturally going to look at the adventuring party as an extended part of their family, right? They're going to include them, or slowly they're going to become part of their family. And so that's how they're going to look at them, whether the PCs look at him that way or them that way. The gnome's going to look, after a few adventures at least, it's going to look at each and every character as an extended part of their family. And again, that gives you a lot of role-playing opportunities. Another aspect of playing gnomes is if they're gnome-like. Are they very gnome-like? Are they the classic inquisitive, happy-go-lucky? And if they're not, why are they not that way? What makes your gnome not gnome-like? And I think, again, filled with role-playing opportunities, also a good backstory, which could be useful for the GM if they incline to use your backstory in their adventures or in their long arc ideas. And I think they're very versatile, gnomes. I mean, they're really cool in a urban setting, right? And in the wild, they're also very cool, right? Because the aspects of a gnome fit either one very well, right? If you're in a city, you can disappear and not be noticed. So very useful if you're doing subterfuge and stuff like that. And in the woods or in the great outdoors, the same thing. If you are a gnome in a fight in the woods or in the wherever in the wild, you can hide. A lot of them have abilities to talk to animals. They cast minor illusions, and depends on the type of gnome and depend on the class that you are. So I think gnomes are very versatile because of that.
So there you go. I think you should try to play a gnome.
Yeah, I think they're pretty fun. I mean, the last 2 characters I played have been gnomes, except for the Shadowrun, which Jolene wouldn't let me play a gnome.
Oh, they don't have gnomes.
I was going to modify a dwarf.
I know, but I told you I didn't want you to do that.
Actually, there's a book. Of
course there is.
I forget what book it is, but there is a, what do you call it? A companion or whatever. A supplement for Shadowrun. And they include other races that you can play. Like, they include a whole bunch. And gnomes is one of them.
Oh, really?
Yep. Anyway, so I think they're fun. They're very interesting type of character to play. And if you
want to branch out, play a gnome.
Play a gnome.
So there you go. This is Gaming Perspectives with
Saul,
Jolene.
and you have a good day.